Hey, Renato, did we learn anything new from the January 6th committee report?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down to a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, in part because I was quarantining in Europe, I ended up spending a bunch of time over the holidays, on TV appearances talking about January 6th, much more than I expected. And it was just back to back to back coverage, breaking down every chapter, every line. It's not clear to me. We talked before the holidays about, I think neither of us were thinking this report was going to change things all that much. It's not clear to me that anything really did change for us.
Yeah, I think what the January 6th committee report shows, it's 845 pages long. They've been releasing all of these transcripts, is just the breadth and depth of the investigation they undertook. And I think we have to really appreciate the value that adds, because whatever comes out of the Department of Justice, as we've discussed before, is going to be, potentially a sliver of that, whatever crosses the threshold of criminal activity. But it won't necessarily tell the whole story. And I think that that's what this report does, and all of the transcripts. Much of the stuff we were just discussing before we came on, that was making headlines, I felt like I had heard before, like this stuff about Mark Meadows burning documents. I can't remember if it had just been reported and now it's new because it's officially in the report. But a lot of it did seem like things that we had known, but maybe because it had been coming out piecemeal, it wasn't as powerful as it is now coming out all together with everything else.
Yeah, I do think that there is an element to which, there was a power to everything being together and having the weight of all this material. I do think they did a nice job of weaving together a narrative, but I have to say, I don't really think that there was a lot that they left on the table that wasn't already in the televised proceedings. I mean, there were certainly details, interesting text messages between Tony Ornato and Cassidy Hutchinson, for example, that tended to corroborate her account. I don't know why they didn't bring that out during the hearing. I think that they probably just, had so much material. It was hard for them to get it all marshaled. I mean, it was clear. It's clear to me that they were struggling to just get everything out the door, because otherwise you wouldn't want to dump this like right during the holidays. Like, you would have been far better off doing that a month earlier. But I think they just were, trying their best to get through everything and get it done. But I have to say, there are some people who, after all of the days and days and days of coverage of the January 6th report, are now saying, if Garland does not charge, whatever, or, he really should be Jack Smith charged, whatever, out of January 6th, like there's a dereliction of duty and all of this sort of over the top stuff. I have to say, nothing about what was in the January 6th report changes my view of the challenges of bringing charges there. I mean, does anything there change your view on that?
No, the law is the law. I think they have a lot of transcripts to go through. I don't know how long DOJ has had many of these transcripts, or if they're getting them just now. I'm curious about that. I'll say a few things. I do think, seeing it all together, the committee did make a pretty good case. They did have the through line of Trump specifically. That's who they were focused on, right? And this idea that this was premeditated. It was very carefully kind of plotted and coordinated, at least in terms of the interference in the electoral vote count. That violence was anticipated. I don't know that there's the direct connection still between Trump and that, but that people like Hope Hicks anticipated, they kind of were worried about this before January 6th happened. And I think that that sort of premeditation and understanding will be helpful for the Justice Department in establishing Trump's state of mind. Whether it will be enough for them to bring charges, I think remains to be seen. But I think that there was kind of put all together a compelling case there. There was also something apart from Trump, I think that was not new, but I guess it was new. This idea of Cassidy Hutchinson's lawyer essentially more or less counseling her to lie, which is problematic. I think that was an interesting thread that might be worth talking about.
Yeah, gosh, I think I had some private conversations where I was very aggressively blunt with some other commentators who were making big proclamations about that. I mean, so Cassidy Hutchinson's lawyer essentially told her, like, just say you don't recall. He was really pushing her to say that, even if she did recall. There was some public commentary and tweets by lawyers saying, "Oh my God, essentially he should be charged for this. He's going to lose his law license, and they should be pursuing charges." And I will just tell you that maybe sounds good in a tweet, but it runs very counter to my experience. And I think what I said privately to one of those people was that I would bet my life savings that he's not charged with anything. And that's just because I've seen so much of that. I mean, unfortunately, first of all, the situation that she was in, having a lawyer provided to her, paid by somebody else, who is looking for other people's interests in addition to her own, is really a sad feature of a system we have where it is okay for viewed as ethical and not problematic for third parties to pay for legal fees. It happens constantly, all the time. And I have had many cases where I represent defendants who end up bringing me in at some point because they're concerned that their lawyer, they're like Cassidy Hutchinson, they were concerned that their lawyer wasn't fully looking out for their interests. It's just a very common occurrence. And this issue of lawyers trying to convince their witnesses to say they don't recall, is it problematic? Yes. Could you say that that's potentially a crime that's charged? Sure. But this is, I think, part of the issue with like a lot of legal analysis. Like, is it like on a law school exam? Could you like say like, is this potentially a crime? Like, yeah, but in the real world, how do you prove what her lawyer was telling her beyond a reasonable doubt?
What is the crime they claim? Witness tampering or supporting perjury?
That he was corruptly trying to influence her testimony. And this is some sort of crime you should be investigated for. Well, it's a he said, she said. He's going to say she misunderstood his advice. And he's going to say, all I was telling her to do is if she does not specifically recall the conversation, to say she doesn't recall. And that, by the way, some of our listeners may be like, hey, that's not proper. Like, if she recalls something, she should volunteer what she has. But a lot of lawyers will provide that counsel to a witness, like, hey, unless you're absolutely certain, just say you don't recall, because, you don't want to misremember something and get yourself in trouble. So he's going to say that's what he was saying. She's going to say something different. It's going to be chalked up as a misunderstanding. You're not going to be able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. That's just the reality of this in the real world, because our standard of proof is so high in a criminal case.
Yeah. And I think this just goes to the bigger picture of everyone just being so trigger happy about wanting to find criminal charges. Things do not have to be a crime to be wrong. In other words, we can still condemn, certain types of behavior, and it doesn't have to get to, will he be charged with a crime? And there are other forms of accountability. And one of the things that I've written about recently is that, that we fail to appreciate the different mechanisms of accountability that we have outside of the criminal justice system, and that we should be paying attention to it. So, for example, speaking of lawyers, The professional, the disciplinary process for lawyers, that right now people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani are undergoing disciplinary proceedings. I don't know if this would rise to that. It probably wouldn't. It's a high bar. But my point is, I'm kind of sick of, like, will he be charged with a crime?
Right.
It gets so
I
old
agree with
because it's
that.
sort of like, like, it's complicated. I mean, like, there's a lot of different factors, but what happens is that when we make that the bar, what we're implicitly suggesting is that if it doesn't meet that bar, that it's okay. And there is, by the way, a bar for moral and ethical, and permissible conduct that is below the threshold of criminal conduct, and we should be holding people to that standard and be talking about those types of norms and expectations, and we don't. And unfortunately, I think it's a development that's happened since Trump came to office, that all we care about is criminal prosecution. It's super annoying to me, to be honest.
It's very annoying to me. I mean, the other thing that's annoying to me is this idea that, well, first of all, like every crime is immediately punished and has to be punished, and if it's not, like that's somehow some problem with our system. Like there's crimes all the time that don't get punished. Like every time someone swipes a pack of gum from your local 7-Eleven, is there a criminal prosecution of that? Like, I mean, probably not. Okay, so I mean, yes, that's the real world in which we live in. I will say another thing that's super annoying to me is that somehow if I point the reality of the situation out, that I'm defending this, like somehow I'm defending her lawyer, coaching witnesses to lie or mislead the people. No, I'm not doing that. I'm just being truthful to the public by not like putting something out there that's going to get 30,000 retweets or likes, but is actually not at all true. I just, one of the things that's been very frustrating to me over the years, and I've been kind of doing a lot of public legal commentary now for you and I have, right? I remember from early 2017, it's been several years now, is just like this idea that like, well, there's this massive amplification of opinions that are silly about everything turning into criminal prosecution. And then if you call that into question or say that's not actually true, you're somehow defending the wrongdoers, or you're on their side, or you're an apologist. And I'm none of those things. I'm just trying to be very realistic with in this case, our listeners, or in the case of tweets, whoever's reading them.
I think the big takeaway is that whatever liability, professional, criminal, or whatever, this lawyer has, clearly the takeaway was that Cassidy Hutchinson did not feel that she was free to be completely forthcoming under that person's counsel, and eventually ended up changing lawyers and being much more forthcoming. And I think we need to be grateful that, we do have her testimony, because it illuminated a lot of pieces that otherwise this cone of silence would have kept in the shadows. That's, I think, really the main point of her testimony.
I agree. And I think, kudos to her, and I think it's Alyssa Griffin is her name, who helped her get a new attorney who represented her, by the way, pro bono. So kudos to all of those people for creating a situation in which she could come forward and give truthful testimony. One thing I will say, Asha, is a takeaway that I did want to talk about from all of this is, one thing that is really the case for this January 6th investigation, unlike, let's say, the Mar-a-Lago case and some of the other criminal investigations that DOJ has, is that this is a case in which now the DOJ is coming in second. And they are essentially taking over an investigation that in many ways has already been begun by Congress. And I think it has some implications. When I was a federal prosecutor, I used to investigate a lot of cases, they call it in parallel, with the SEC or the CFTC, agencies that investigate securities and commodities, fraud and other types of related crimes in the financial markets. And it definitely changes things when the SEC has already interviewed everyone under oath, and you have transcripts of what they're going to say. And it helps in certain respects, because sometimes they lock everyone in, and it's sometimes great, because I literally had trials where these fancy New York lawyers just sitting there as I was playing transcripts of their clients testifying under oath, and there's nothing they could do about it. Their clients said you have to eat that testimony. On the other hand, though, It definitely, when you have really competent counsel in the SEC or SEFTC investigation, it creates a situation where everyone is coached to have certain just so stories and they don't remember, and it gives them an opportunity to kind of obfuscate. Whereas if I sent FBI agents in from the beginning to like surprise people at their homes, and they gave quick statements without having lawyers present, they might give more truthful answers or more candid answers, or they might make a mistake in what they say. And you can often generate more criminal prosecutions that way. So I do think it has benefits and drawbacks.
Yeah. The last takeaway I would say about the January 6th committee report is because it was focused on Trump, they really didn't highlight, I think, the intelligence failures and the law enforcement failures. In fact, they were quite laudatory, it seemed like,
Hmm.
of the law enforcement. Even saying, while there was stuff out there, basically these agencies did the best they could. And I've been a little bit more critical of how the FBI in particular responded to this. I wrote a piece for Just Security about that. And I get that it was probably beyond the scope of the committee's, not beyond their purview, but just in terms of what they had the capacity to do in the time frame they had to do it. But it was a little disappointing, I think, to see them kind of let the agencies off the hook, as opposed to saying something like this warrants further review.
That's a really smart comment, Asha. I agree with that. I think that from my perspective, I think it was a political decision that was made. In other words, this wasn't the 9/11 Commission, some nonpartisan, bipartisan group that's brought in to effectively be a history making exercise where we like examine what happened. It
Yeah.
was a political committee, an operation, and they I think smartly decided that the story is much more compelling if you have a single straightforward story. And that's 100% right. I mean, as a trial lawyer, one of the mistakes people make is they try to put on everything and tell everything and say everything. Just having a straightforward singular story is always best. So I think focusing on Trump made sense for what they were trying to
Hmm.
do. But yeah, I think, if you were a historian looking at this, you'd be like, hey, we really need to explore this. Or like, what about exploring all the stuff that happened with the military? I mean, some of the most interesting stuff that came out of the January 6th report was like, there was a military commander who's like, I'm just sending in troops. Like, screw this. I don't know if I have a clear order, but like, we need to act. Like, there's people attacking the U.S. Capitol, and a lawyer in the military is like, no, you can't do that based on some standing order, yada yada yada. And so he ended up deciding not to do it, even though his initial implication was to send in troops to protect the Capitol. I mean, I think that's just really fascinating, and it seems to me like we might want to figure out what
Yeah.
our military can and should do when our institutions are under attack. I think those are big, weighty questions, but they're not really explored by the committee at all. All right, Asha. So let's talk about the craziness going on in the House. We're recording this on the 4th, on Wednesday. So maybe by now you're going to have Speaker Donald Trump or Speaker Kevin McCarthy or Speaker Jim Jordan or God knows who. But for right now, we're in the midst of the craziness that's going on there. And I will say, Ash, I think it just reveals some of the problems that there are with the current Republican Party. While I was quarantining and I was, on Twitter, there was some guy talking about the philosophies of the Republican Party, the governing philosophy of the Republican Party. I usually stick to legal topics when I tweet, but I replied to him like, "What is the governing philosophy of the Republican Party that you claim there is?" I can't figure out what it is. It seems to me like a totally diffuse group of people who are basically like trying to own the libs and get attention for themselves. And so I think that's part of the problem here. It's not like they're united behind some sort of common agenda and they're like so excited about coming together to do tax cuts. They just seem like they're all out for themselves and, pointing fingers at each other and squabbling like junior high school students.
Yeah, there's a great book called Burning Down the House by Princeton professor Julian Zelizer, and it is about Newt Gingrich. And I think if you go back, the the dysfunction and polarization in Congress is really like has its roots in 1995 when Newt Gingrich takes over, right? And I would say the philosophy is sort of the Cobra Kai philosophy, right? Strike first, strike hard, no mercy, no compromise. And I think that strain has just continued and intensified to the point where now it's internal. It's eating itself alive, right? As you said, I think that these extremists in the Republican Party relish kind of breaking the system, right? These are the same people who wanted to paralyze the peaceful transition of power and upend it. So to me, it's not shocking that they are willing to do, I don't see them compromising or caving in this situation. In fact, I think just a recap for people who didn't watch it, it was really fascinating. I've never watched one of these votes before, maybe because they were always unremarkable. And, I'm sure they were on C-SPAN, but I didn't watch it. But I was just glued to the television yesterday because they kept doing these votes. And McCarthy kept losing. And I think by the third vote, he had even lost votes from his own party. And it was sort of like, I don't know how many times you do this. I was reading a newsletter from Heather Cox Richardson, who is a historian. And she said, a lot of people are citing, the 1923, I think is the last time that that someone lost a speaker vote. But she actually went back to 1855, where I think it took something along the lines of 133 votes.
Wow.
Until they finally came up with basically a compromise candidate that could create sort of a coalition where they were able to get votes from both parties. And I thought that was a really interesting historical comparison because, I think that also was a time of high polarization, kind of in many ways, I would think parallel to, the extreme divisions that were happening in the country, et cetera. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting. I'm not really sure where it goes. Do they just keep voting? Is that just what happens until somebody gets a majority? Is that the idea?
My understanding, I'm not an expert on this, but is that there's no rules right now in the House. And I think there's not even technically House members, I think is how it is. So yeah, they have to keep voting until the majority of the House decides something different. In other words, the majority in the House could vote to change the rules so a plurality could elect a speaker. But until that happens, until the majority agrees on something, nothing's going to happen. And so there's a lot of different ways that this could go. I mean, one way is there could be some Democrats who could, in exchange for something for the Democrats, like more committee assignments or more freedom of some rights of the minority, we're willing to lend some votes for something, even if it's just changing the rules or something along those lines. Or there could be a consensus candidate that comes. But I mean, you have to think the Republicans will get their act together to a point so some Republican will be the speaker because that they have the votes. And so if they could just come together and do that, that would make a lot of sense for them. And I think they would be vilified if, let's say, Hakeem Jeffries ended up as the speaker. But who knows? We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's also worth kind of looking ahead, given this extreme faction. And we were just talking about the January 6th committee report on where they're going to go with that. Now, a few weeks ago, you and I talked on the podcast about, the potential for them to bury the report or the information. And, I think practically speaking, that's not going to be possible now that everything's sort of been released out there. Though there does seem to be some ball in motion, because my understanding is that the January 6th committee has also sent its materials to the National Archives for it to basically be there, and that these House Republicans intend to demand NARA to return those. And so I guess under the theory that they don't want that to be a part of the official archives of the United States. I'm not really sure, and I'm not really sure where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's one. They only control one house of Congress. I mean, this is part of the problem that they have based on how the November elections went. Right? They control one house of Congress. On its own, it really can't do much of anything other than make statements and pass bills that the Senate rejects. Because the Democrats now have a clear majority. They don't even have a power sharing agreement or whatever. They have a clear majority in the Senate. Obviously the president is a Democrat. So they're going to do all these performative statements, and essentially the Democrats are going to react to those. I mean, I actually think from a Biden presidential perspective, for the perspective of President Biden, this is actually a great situation for him, because he's not going to get blamed for not doing things, because the House Republicans are going to be obstructionists, and they're not going to let him accomplish anything. And he's going to be reacting to some of their very extreme partisan proposals. And then, ultimately that's going to be the contrast. It's going to be House Republicans versus him. I mean, obviously it's possible the Republicans are going to come up with some new outsider, new fresh face candidate for president, but we'll see. I'll believe it when I see it.
And Biden is tooling around Kentucky today with Mitch McConnell, which was shocking.
There's the bipartisanship. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I know, it is very interesting. But I guess Mitch wants credit for going along with the infrastructure bill. So, wish we could see more of that.
Indeed. I mean, I just think that would be better for the country. I will say, I do think Biden has made good on his promise to work together with Republicans to get things passed. He passed quite a few bills in a couple of years, but I certainly think that will change. There's the House Republicans are much more radical because they are from gerrymandered districts. You can't gerrymander state lines, and so somebody who gets elected statewide, even if it's in a Republican state, is probably going to be less extreme than somebody who is elected in a very highly gerrymandered Republican seat that they can never lose. Because in that context, and the person who wins that gerrymandered seat is basically whoever can get through a primary, which tends to be the people who are the more extreme are going to vote. So the House tends to, and it's also the House's, of course, there's a seniority issue in terms of who the leadership is. So I just think the House Republicans are, going to be more extreme, and it's going to be hard for him to work together with them. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years. In the meantime, he's going to be confirming a lot of judges.
Yeah, and that's a good thing,
without a doubt.
So Renato, before we go, you were a little delayed getting back from your trip because you and your wife got COVID. So tell us about that, because I think you were on TV a lot during that time, which you mentioned, and you were kind of in these hostage video shots on like CNN and MSNBC, stuck in your hotel room.
Yeah, so we were supposed to come back on the 29th, but my wife started feeling really sick on Christmas Eve. We were in Europe doing a cruise of the Rhine and going to all these Christmas markets, which is something we really enjoyed. But Christmas Eve, my wife started feeling really sick. I went on the excursion without her, and then Christmas Day, she tested positive for COVID. So I had to get us immediately off of this cruise ship into, at the time, separate hotel rooms. I had not tested positive. I tested positive a day or two later. So, we ended up combining hotel rooms, shortly thereafter. But nonetheless, I was stuck in a hotel room, and all we were doing is just sleeping and recovering. And it was definitely disappointing. We ended up extending our stay through the 3rd just to recover.
Where were you? In Amsterdam?
So actually, we were stuck in Basel, Switzerland, because we flew to Amsterdam, and the cruise was kind of ending up in Switzerland. We were going to go to Milan after that, and unfortunately, we never made it there. We had to have a switch in plans. But it is what it is. We were glad to spend the time together. I will say it was disappointing for us to get COVID, because after 3+ years, I don't know if we thought we were indestructible, but we were one of those people who were ordinarily super careful. And this is the price we paid for going on a cruise
So
ship
this
and
was your
whatever.
first time getting COVID?
Yes. Have
Oh.
you gotten it before?
I got it in June. And I know what you mean. Like actually I got it in late May, early June. I think there was sort of a wave going around here
Mm-hmm.
anyway. But before I got it, I agree with you. I mean, I had been very diligent about wearing masks and, but I was like kind of like, well, maybe some people just don't get it. And I'm one of those people.
Yeah, I thought so too. I was like, oh, wow, I got a great immune system or something. But it's really because I was careful, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
be, going in huge crowds and whatever. And so, yeah, you're on a cruise ship, it's going to happen. And the reason I ended up doing the TV appearances, we were literally stuck in our rooms with nothing to do for days. But I didn't bring a suit with me. I didn't bring any of my usual setup. So if you actually saw behind the scenes, we had these like MacGyver setups where we had like all these like bath towels and COVID test kits and other things propping up my iPad, and then my wife holding like whatever lighting we had in the room like up
That's
is
so
like she was like my
funny.
key grip or whatever during the appearance.
I'm surprised you didn't pack a ring light. Always take a ring light with you.
I know my wife's like, you didn't pack anything. You didn't pack a stand for your iPad or anything. I was like, no, I wanted to take the time off and spend it with her and not be on television or do anything like that. But we had like nothing to do when we were stuck there. I was like, we're just
Yeah.
literally sitting here, whatever, watching
Well,
Netflix.
yeah, the 845-page January 6th report to read.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God.
Well, I'm glad you're back, and I'm glad you're back safely and on the mend. And I'm excited to enter the new year.
So am I. I'm excited about that. And I'm excited about growing the podcast. Thanks to all of you for helping us launch that in 2022. And I'm excited to see where this podcast goes in the year to come. So
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year. Like, subscribe if you're on YouTube, and please talk up our podcast to your friends.